Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight as we explore the details of Isabella Stewart Gardner's life, friends, travels, and collections. My name is Helen Liu, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager from Cary Library. Beyond the Library and Cary Library's Museum Pass program is sponsored by the Friends of Cary Library. Cary Library has 23 discounted passes to a variety of wonderful places. Check with your local library for more information on their Museum Pass program. I would like to also thank the libraries in Ashland, Needham, Newton, Norwood, the Peabody Institute Library in Danvers, Randall Library in Stowe, and Thomas Crane Library in Quincy for partnering with us on this program. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A. We'll have time for questions at the end of the event. Thank you for saying hello, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. It's so nice to have you. Now I'd like to welcome our speaker. Mary C. Woodward has spent more than 40 years in the museum and historic home business, having earned her BA and MA degrees in art history. She has worked at large comprehensive collections such as the Cleveland Museum of Art and tiny properties like the 17th century log cabin that was the birthplace of President James K. Polk. Since moving to Massachusetts in 2010, Mary has worked at the Old Manse in Concord, Mass., the Concord Museum, and now Historic New England, previously as lead guide at the Gropius House in Lincoln, and currently as lead guide at the Winslow Crocker House in Yarmouthport. For 6 years, she established and managed the gallery at the Chelmsford Center for the Arts, an exhibition space for local artists. In the last few years, she's enjoyed taking art history talks on the road to various libraries and retirement communities. When she's not at work, she's in her yard pretending to garden. Welcome, Mary. It's so wonderful to have you this evening.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Helen, particularly for the invitation to speak tonight for Lexington's Cary Library and your partner libraries. I appreciate it. The Gilded World of Isabella Stewart Gardner. The life of Boston's art patroness typifies the lives of many of the wealthy and cultured Americans who lived during the Gilded Age of American history. We'll explore those details, as Helen said, of Isabella's life, friends, travels, and her art collections in this illustrated talk. Imagine a Washington, D.C. filled with corrupt politicians, powerful millionaires getting richer while the poor get poorer. Imagine people arguing about whether America's military should intervene in other countries' internal affairs. And imagine the ever-growing push to make more things, sell more things, and have more things. Does that sound like current times? Well, perhaps it does, but these were some of the conditions found in the US during the Gilded Age, the years from the 1870s to the 1920s. The Gilded Age was the name of a novel by Mark Twain, who you see in a caricature there, and Charles Dudley Warner from 1873. The term they coined in their book was used in a derogatory way. It was a satirical look at greed and corruption and power. But during those same years, the great wealth being generated by American businesses was being put to good use. The period has also been called the American Renaissance. Industries grew like iron and steel, railroads, shipbuilding, shipping, and manufacturing. According to the graphic I've put up here, you can see John D. Rockefeller amassed the largest fortune created by an American during this period, adjusted for today's values, those ones on the top. And who would join them in that billionaires club? Well, I've put a few of today's wealthiest on the list as well for us to go have a look at. The rich, the super rich during the Gilded Age were eager to acquire culture. And one of the ways to do that was by collecting art. There was a growing sophistication and elegance in American culture, educated and refined aspect to the Gilded Age for sure. The homes they built for themselves, these romantic, historically inspired homes, were popping up in places like Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, Italian palazzo, French chateaus, and German castles. The breakers that you see here was built by Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson in 1893. It's in the Italian Renaissance style. It's, according to Newport standards, still referred to as a cottage, even though it sports about 70 rooms. This was the world, the gilded world of Isabella Stewart Gardner. She was born in New York City in 1840 to an industrialist and his wife. The Stewart family believed they were descended from Mary, Queen of Scots. That wasn't true, actually, but they proceeded as if it was true. She was educated as society girls were then in small private schools and taught the fundamentals for young society girls like French and watercolor and piano. Later in life, she was asked, "Did you study hard?" And she replied, "Well, if it was against the rules, I did." And then she was asked, "In what subject did you excel?" And Isabella answered, "I could run faster than anyone else in school." Her parents sent her to a finishing school as a 16-year-old in Paris, and well, naturally, they went along with her while she was there. As a teenager traveling with her family throughout Europe, she was inspired by a private museum that they visited in Milan, where she saw a splendid collection that was housed in a fine house. She told a friend who recounted it years later that if she ever had any money, that is what she would like to create, a private house museum. While the Gardners were in, the Stewarts were in Paris, and Isabella was in Paris, they met the Gardners of Boston, and she became friends with the daughters of the Gardners. The Gardners had made their fortunes beginning in the 17th century and pursued on into the 18th and 19th centuries with the fleet of clipper ships in the China trade, and then industrial pursuits like railroads and mines and mills. She did not meet the Gardners' son, the older brother to the daughters, Jack, until they were all back in the States, and Julia Gardner asked Isabella Stewart to come up from New York for a visit. Jack, as John Lowell Gardner II was called, had been at Harvard but didn't finish, instead going straight into his father's trading business. He was considered quite the catch. So imagine the upset in Boston's social circles when he falls for a girl from New York City. They married in 1860. This is probably a photographic portrait on the occasion of their marriage. Not necessarily the day of, but to honor that they are a couple. Just shy of her 20th birthday. Her father gave them a home at 152 Beacon Street in the Back Bay as a wedding gift. 2 years later, after their wedding, their son, John Lowell Gardner III, called Jackie, was born. Sadly, he died of pneumonia before his 2nd birthday. Then Isabella had a miscarriage, and her doctors recommended that she not pursue any more pregnancies. So in order to recover from their sadness over Jackie's death and over concern that Isabella might never recover from her depression, it was decided that Jack should take her abroad. They went to the usual tourist spots, but they were also quite adventurous, going on elephant rides in Cambodia, for instance. Here are some photos. The scrapbook on the upper right is open to some pages from their 3-month trip to Japan. They had hosted, before they went, they hosted a series of lectures in their home on Beacon Hill, or Beacon Street, by one of the leading scholars of Japanese culture and history. So I like to think of it as like an early version of Rhodes Scholars. They were interested in studying and learning, and then they proceeded to take a very intensive 3-month-long trip there. Isabella kept a diary of her travels, a scrapbook where she wrote, she observed, she pasted in photographs, she did some sketching, as you can see on the left there. She tucked in flowers and leaves, all the things that we might do. And even though some of the locations were pretty far-flung and exotic, it really wasn't roughing it by any means. Even in the most remote places, they traveled with their own caravan of 8 horses, 5 mules, 2 donkeys with retainers and tents. I think it's what we would call glamping these days. They did go to Egypt, and you can see from the drawing there, the page that from Isabella's diary. This is what she wrote about one day. Cairo, she says, the people had stepped out of the Arabian Nights, which were no longer tales we had read, but were bits of real life happening with us looking on, and we had truly come abroad and forgot ourselves. That same day, this is what her husband Jack recorded in his diary. Friday, December 11, 1874. Left Alexandria about 8:30 a.m., arrived Cairo 12:30 p.m., went to Shepherd's Hotel. Very good, except full of fleas. Now, what the Gardners, what was their home life like? Well, they liked to entertain. Here they are socializing at home on Beacon Street. And notice the 2 white spots, let me go ahead, on Isabella's headband. You see those? When they're this large, diamonds have names. Raja comes in at 26 carats, and Light of India comes in at 16 carats. Those were in her headband. Certainly, there were plenty of tales about Isabella in the Boston Society columns, stories that would start with an already amazing fact and then spiral out of control. For example, apparently she really did visit the zoo and managed to bring home 2 lion cubs to play with. But the tale grew to become reports of her walking a full-grown lion on a leash while wearing jewels down the Boston streets. Still, she herself is quoted as saying, "Don't spoil a good story by telling the truth." In her 70s, she caused quite a stir at Symphony Hall, where she appeared in her seat wearing a white headband with the words, "Oh, you Red Sox," written in red on it. You could say she was trying in her own way to fit into Boston society. It was said that Mrs. Jack, as she was known, invited a prize fighter to come to 152 Beacon Street, her home, strip down to his fighting trunks and stand behind a screen so that his shadow would delight her lady guests one afternoon. According to the story, the ladies wanted to dispense with the screen, and the fighter thereupon came out and flexed his muscles for them. One young woman at the time wrote in her journal, "Of course, father never lets us go to Mrs. Gardner's parties." As one author notes, one could never feel sure whether the party at Mrs. Jack's music room was for muscles or for Mozart. And an anonymous reporter for the local paper described her at this time as one of the 7 wonders of Boston, saying there is nobody like her in any city in the country. Well, it wasn't all fun and games at the Gardner's house. Isabella took the radical step of enrolling herself in a lecture course being taught by a Harvard professor. This was at a time when educating women was considered controversial by plenty of people. Some suggest her interest in gaining more education for herself was due to the fact that they had children in their lives now. From 1875 onwards, they raised their 3 nephews after they were orphaned. The boys were 14, 12, and 10 when they came to live with the Gardners. And there was another young man that came into their lives in the 1880s. Bernard Berenson was still an undergraduate at Harvard when he attracted the attention of the Gardners. He wanted to travel to Europe to study literature, and he needed funding. The Gardners were among a group of people who provided a fellowship for him. He went to Europe and switched from literature to art, but we were all the better for it. They particularly were, because Bernard Berenson became a renowned scholar of Italian Renaissance art in particular. And most importantly, for the people in that group, he became a connoisseur and an advisor and a buying agent to Mrs. Jack and many others for many years. The Gardner Museum recently posted this quote on their Instagram account, and it's just a bit of a conversation or letter between Isabella and Berenson, where they're discussing her goals for her museum, and she's instructing him with this comment: "Let us aim awfully high. If you don't aim, you can't get there." So from the beginning, she wanted to pursue really excellence in art. The artist most closely associated with her through his long series of portraits is John Singer Sargent. She owned 60 works in all by him in total. They met through friends. He was a prominent society portrait painter. In 1882, he painted this fabulous piece, The Four Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, and we still marvel at them at Boston's MFA. Then he caused a scandal in Paris with his portrait of Madame X. Monsieur X, Monsieur Gautreau, would not accept the portrait of his wife. And so it was in Sargent's studio in England when he met Isabella Stewart Gardner. 5 years later, Sargent was in Boston to paint portraits. This time, he was painting a portrait of Mrs. Edward Boyd. It was customary for artists painting a portrait to stay with their subject as a house guest. But when Mr. Boyd had to leave town, it was not proper for Sargent to stay any longer at the Boyd's home. So he was put up at the Gardner's house. Well, naturally, Isabella wanted him to paint her portrait too, and she got her own scandal. She was 47 years old, at one of her most formidable periods, confident and in control, as one author writes. Sargent painted her against a 16th century velvet brocade panel of fabric, patterned and positioned so that her head seems to be crowned by the pattern, and certainly a halo surrounds her head. It was Sargent's idea for her to wear her pearls roped around her waist, but I'm sure she agreed. She was quite proud of her figure. Together, they created a stir. So much power, so much confidence, so much cleavage. Sargent called the painting woman an enigma. It was shown in 1888 at one exhibit in town, and then the nasty gossip began. Her husband, Jack Gardner, was angered by the gossip, and he made the gallery take the painting off view. It was kept up at home, but it was never publicly seen again during Jack's lifetime. In fact, once her museum was open, she directed that that room not be open to the public until after her death. Yet I believe Isabella was quite happy with the portrayal. She later added a related painting to her collection, another view of Madame X by Sargent, called Madame Gautreau Drinking a Toast. I would interpret this as a celebratory toast from one independent-minded woman to another, but that's just me. Another stunning portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner was painted a few years later while the Gardners were staying in Venice. The Swedish artist Anders Zorn captured this fresh image of her on the balcony of the Palazzo Barbaro on the Grand Canal. It's 1894. She's 55 years old. Zorn has been trying to create a successful portrait of her, and naturally he's growing anxious at his failed attempts. One evening, as the Gardners and their friends were socializing, she stepped out onto the balcony to see a fireworks display, and suddenly she turned, came back in, and it was the right moment. It was as if she was radiant with light. herself. And there's that magnificent strand of pearls. Now, we're going to take a minute to speak another word longer about the role that Venice played in their lives. Venice, unlike English-dominated Florence or church-dominated Rome, Venice was a playground. The light, the color, the water, if you've had the pleasure of being there before, you know what I mean. The crumbling plaster, the art. Was there ever a more romantic and intriguing city? The Gardners were part of a large circle of friends who gathered there often. And the Palazzo Barbaro was a medieval palace owned by a Boston family, the Curtises, who were relatives of Jack Gardner's. Architecturally speaking, this is going to look familiar when we see how Venice inspired Isabella in the creation of her museum, which we are getting to. Now, years later, after the years in Venice and after her husband Jack had passed away, another group of friends came into Isabella Stewart Gardner's life, accepted her and basked in her warmth and generosity. They were the residents of Dabbsville. A. Piatt Andrew, the man you see in the far left corner of your screen, and Isabella Stewart Gardner, seated there in all black with the white gloves, met in the summer of 1903. He was an assistant professor of economics at Harvard. He built a summer home called Red Roof, and you can see it on the right there, on Eastern Point, on the shoreline near Gloucester. Andrew's home was soon joined by the homes of some of his close friends, and Dabbsville was the name this group of artists and intellectuals gave themselves, using the letters of their surnames. D was for Joanna Davidge, a proprietress of a finishing school in New York, who's not pictured here. A was for A. Piatt Andrew. B is for someone else who isn't in that photo, the portrait painter Cecilia Beau. S was for Henry Sleeper, who we do see sitting next to Isabella. He was a popular interior decorator. And also S stood for Caroline Sinkler, there in the top row, a South Carolina Society belle. Now, Isabella Stewart Gardner didn't have a home on Eastern Point, but she was a frequent guest in the others' homes, and she was given honorary status as a resident of Dabbsville. That is her with her back to us, sitting in the chair with the cloth over it and the initial Y. And that's because at this point in her life, she was spelling her name Isabella with a Y instead of an I. The group inspired, supported, and entertained one another. And we'll hear about Henry Sleeper in just a little bit because he stays involved in her life, very much so. Now, the serious art collecting begins. And in order for that to happen, an influx of money came into her life, in a sad way, of course. Isabella Stewart Gardner's father died in 1891, and he left her a small fortune. She wasn't nearly as wealthy as those billionaires we mentioned earlier, but she inherited $1.75 million, and in today's value, that's almost $50 million. Starting the very next year, she and Jack began to seriously collect art for their home on Beacon Hill. She bought 174 paintings in a little over 9 years. And just a note to clarify, so many of the famous works of art that we see now at the Gardner Museum were purchased while they were still living on Beacon Street, while their museum was still just a dream. In 1896, Bernard Berenson recommended that Isabella buy a Rembrandt self-portrait. You see it here, dated 1629, the first self-portrait he ever did, aged 23. He was asking whether or not she wanted it, and he sent her a simply worded cable, yes, Rembrandt, or no Rembrandt. She replied, yes. And here it is, you see, from a photo in 1900 of it in the drawing room of their home on Beacon Street. Another highlight from this time, and in one of the unfortunately stolen works, is the concert by Johannes Vermeer on the left. Isabella was in competition not only with other collectors, but with large museums over the acquisition of the Vermeer. She was told that the Louvre and London's National Gallery were both wanted it, but didn't want to bid against one another at the auction. Well, so guess who came out on top? She did, with a bid of $6,000, in today's money, about $158,000, a bargain, right? The work, and in the Vermeer, on the right-hand side, on the back wall there, was an actual Dutch painting called the Procurus by Dirk van Barbaren that was owned by Vermeer. He painted it into his own painting. And guess where it's been since 1950? Just next door to the museum at Boston's MFA. Considered by many art scholars to be the most important painting in Boston, Titian's Europa was painted by the Italian artist for King Philip II of Spain. Years later, it was part of a royal dowry sent to England when a Spanish princess was supposed to marry Charles I, the Stuart monarch. The marriage negotiations fell through, but the painting stayed in England. Since Isabella Stewart Gardner thought her family ancestry went back to the royal Stuarts, she felt that she needed to have this piece. It was an important acquisition because it added, at least one author feels, it gave her collecting a kind of focus, and that was Italian art from, say, the medieval through the Baroque period, this is from the Baroque period. Titian's Europa was a well-known and well-respected work of art. It's a work of art that the painter Peter Paul Rubens himself called the greatest painting in the world. And another important painting that they bought at this time was Madonna and Child by the Spanish artist Francisco de Zuberon. She hung it in a private room in their first home on Beacon Street. But in the new house museum, which we're getting to, hang on, she created a Spanish chapel for it and placed it there along with a sign that read "In Memoriam," because it was said that the infant Jesus there looked to her a lot like her lost son, Jackie. And another devotional piece is this one on the right from the workshop of Giovanni Bellini, Christ Carrying the Cross. Is perhaps, again, one of her favorite paintings. It's an intimate devotional work, and the way she arranged it in the museum only amplifies that quality. She set it on a table, perhaps you've seen it, where the viewer, which meant her, she could sit in that chair and meditate on the image. On the table, she also put a silver cup with violets. The flowers always reminded her of her husband, Jack. And the museum has continued the tradition. If they can't get violets, they put another purple flower in there. Interestingly, Bernard Berenson helped her acquire this devotional piece, but he added in his note when she was asking, am I going to get the Bellini? He said, well, yes, you shall have it, yet it is somehow not the kind of thing that I think of for you. And this is strange to me, but it signals perhaps that even those somewhat close to Isabella underestimated the level of her religious devotion. She sat or stood, as you can see here, for a portrait by Lowell's own James McNeill Whistler, which he titled "The Little Note in Yellow and Gold." And later she purchased a similar sized piece, not of herself, but of a nearly nude model entitled "The Violet Note." Tongues wagged when they saw them displayed together at the museum because people assumed that both of the portraits were her, and she let them think so. She was especially in tune with artists and their feelings. Whistler, who was notoriously flippant and biting often, wrote a genuinely sweet note to her. He wrote to Mrs. Gardner, whose appreciation for the work of art is only equaled by her understanding of the artist. Now, in the course of buying all of this art, Isabella and Jack Gardner began to run out of room at at 152 Beacon Street, and they talked about what to do. He was in favor of building in a new section of town, near the newly drained swamps and the newly designed parks to the west of town. She was of the idea that they should expand to adjacent houses on Beacon Street. Suddenly, in December of 1898, Jack died at the age of 61. She mourned him, of course, but she threw her energy into making plans. However, not her plans. She went with Jack's plans. 6 weeks after his death, she bought land west of town. The newly created area called Back Bay Park had been laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted, but it was considered a bit remote. Still, if she built her new home there, she could have open space all around it on all four sides. John had encouraged her to build and create a Venetian palace. And so I've put a big orange star there as to where they situated, or she situated, her museum. She retained William Sears to begin drawing up plans for the new home. The building was built on piles over a marshy area, just like a Venetian palazzo. Over the course of building, she and Sears went back and forth with changes and arguments, threatened workers' strikes, lack of permits, and threats of inspections. Sears really had to be a buffer, I understand, between Isabella and the workforce. Well, she understood the adage that if you want something done the right way, you have to do it yourself. Apparently, she wouldn't let the workers set the columns in place without her being there. Staircases were built and then rebuilt to her specifications. Here's a photo of her. It looks as if it's just from the back, so you just get a silhouette of her. Yes, she's standing on a ladder in the courtyard with paintbrushes, and she's proceeding to show the Italian painters who she brought in to do the work how to create the paint effect and the pink color that she desired. She called her new home Fenway Court, and she moved into her fourth floor apartment on November 18th, 1901. You can clearly see how she communicated her desire for a Venetian palazzo turned inside out on itself to William Sears. He's done this beautiful watercolor sketch here. So she was inspired all those years ago, and now she was getting what she wanted. When it was finished, 150 invitations went out for the evening of January 1st, 1903. By the way, the building work only took about a year and a half, but it took another year and a half until January of 03 for her to put everything just where she wanted it in the museum. And blessedly, that's what we see today. It was an evening on January 1st, her open house was an evening like no other in Boston. The receiving line apparently took forever, January 1st. Think about what she's done to her guests now. Some of them may have been outside waiting to get in, but it took forever because the guests were made to walk up a flight of steps to be greeted by the hostess herself. And she was wearing her two giant diamonds, but now they were on wires, as one visitor wrote, like antenna. Guests were treated to a concert in the music hall at the end of which a mirrored panel, which had shielded their view of any other rooms in the museum, was rolled away, and there was the courtyard at night. Flowers, birds, water fountains, candlelight, lanterns, audible and appreciative gasps from the guests. What she created was and remains astounding, yet from the exterior, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more plainer building. But on the interior, each of the four sides is like the facade of a Venetian palazzo. It was constructed along Renaissance building principles. She did not want a steel-framed building, but she wanted it built up by stone and brick. In the center, a garden, an oasis of warmth and sunshine throughout the year, even in New England's cold winters. In the middle of the garden, a 2nd century Roman mosaic featuring Medusa, that terrifying female from history. So what happens when you build a world-class collection of art that you love and place it inside a palace you've created, and then you invite the public to come inside for a look? During her life, it was only open a few weeks a year, and then on open days, it reduced her to a nervous wreck. But it was her dream come true. She had created a corporation for the purpose of art education, especially by the public exhibit of works of art. On previous trips to Italy, she and Jack had purchased many architectural elements: windows, doors, balconies, columns, most of them dating between the 12th and 15th centuries. And now she had those built into her house museum as well. You see some lovely details in that photo. The plan, as I said at the start, was to open the museum to 200 people a day, 10 days at Easter and 10 days at Thanksgiving. But there were problems immediately. Damages and thefts of small things made her change it to allow only art students who were studying art in school to be allowed. And then she charged them $1 just to be sure that she would have some cash on hand to defray the security costs involved. Now, as I mentioned, most of the works of art on view in the grand rooms of the 2nd and 3rd floors were collected in those years before she built Fenway Court. But she never quit buying art. Even after she moved into this museum, she kept buying. And some of the more intimate sized rooms on the 1st floor are where she displayed a lot of the art that she collected after the museum was open, like the Blue Room, for instance, here on the screen. In 1914, she renovated Fenway Court, and she took out the 2-story tall music room so that she could create 2 levels of gallery space in its place. On one of the levels, the lower level, she created the Spanish cloister. And one reason for the change was to accommodate a painting that wasn't even hers, but it soon would be. This is Sargent's large work, El Jaleo, sort of translated as the ruckus. It belonged to a friend who, perhaps unwisely, lent it to Isabella while he closed his home for the summer. The next time he saw it, she had constructed the Spanish cloister with its curved arch frame of antique stones and floodlights below to mimic the painted light and shadow in the painting. Well, apparently, he gave her the painting on the spot when she showed it to him. When Sargent visited the painting visited her again in 1916, he was entranced. And a few years later, he made a gift to her of a sketchbook of all of the preparatory sketches for that work. But she did modernize Fenway Court during this renovation. She had one of the first telephones installed in Boston, but you know what? You couldn't call her on it because there was no ringer on it. At this point, Isabella began a period of living very economically. She reportedly would send her man out for 2 oranges, but not a dozen, or she'd wear a dress made from brocaded sofa cover for fabric. She was living in just 2 rooms, the bedroom up on the 4th floor and using one of the 1st floor rooms as a living room. What she had in mind was trying to leave enough money behind for the running of the museum, and really nobody had any idea what that would take. A trust was created to run Fenway Court, and Henry Sleeper, the friend from Dabbsville, was named trustee. Henry had a magnificent home of his own called Beauport out there on Eastern Point, and Isabella so admired Beauport, and he so loved Fenway Court, her home, that it was a perfect position for him to take. She left the provision that if anything was moved or if something else was brought in, then the whole thing was done. It could be, everything could be sold and given to Harvard or given to Harvard and they could sell it. But works have been loaned out of her collection. It's just that nothing can take their place while they're away. She also made another provision that on her birthday, every year, a memorial service is held in the chapel, and people who are named Isabella are eligible for free lifetime admission. I hope that applies to somebody listening tonight. She broke all kinds of rules while setting up her museum, but perhaps we can understand this a little better when we learn that her personal motto was "C'est mon plaisir," which is "it's my pleasure." She arranged things the way she wanted to, with relationships between objects that may escape us at first. So it's like an interactive experience. We are presented with assemblages and we can put them together and make them relate to one another by style or theme or color or shape. It's endless possibilities. In one room, for instance, below Titian's Europa, there's a 17th century statuette, and I've put a blue oval around, set on its side to mimic the pose of one of the cherubs in the painting above. Honestly, I have to admit, the first time I saw it, I really wanted to reach out and set it up, thinking someone had knocked it over. Thank goodness I did not touch it, because she wanted it that way. And you can see the little cherubs that it's mimicking in the painting above. Behind that, there's a piece of green and silver silk cut out of one of her Worth of Paris evening gowns, which had shocked Boston, which was probably just as well, because I think the painting shocked Boston too. The fabric features a little tassel pattern, and it recalls, it's the same shape as the bull's tail in the painting. You could just go on and on, really. On Christmas Eve, 1919, she suffered a stroke that left her partly paralyzed. 2 years later, Sargent came to paint her portrait one last time. In this watercolor, she sits confident and poised. It's painted 34 years after her triumphant black dress and brocade portrait. She's still an enigma. We see a calm, controlled, and still powerful elderly woman wrapped in layers of white and quite literally propped up on a sofa, yet facing life and inevitable death rather unapologetically. She was a tastemaker, she was a trendsetter. She created a new type of building, a private house museum, just as she dreamed of as a teenager. In the words of a former curator, she deliberately created a sense of mystery about herself. In fact, she seems to have gone on a bit of a campaign towards the end of her life to burn many of her letters. She had tiles in her bathroom, by the way, that read with this motto, "Think much, speak little, write nothing." She died in 1924 at the age of 84. In just over 25 years, she'd formed a collection of over 2,500 objects. She bequeathed it in her will as a museum for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. Thank you. With that, I'll stop and be happy to entertain your comments or any questions you might have. Thank you.
So Mary, while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts, Isabella had such wonderful vision. Was she ever an artist, or how did she convey her ideas of what she wanted in terms of like the Venetian palazzo and the Spanish cloister? How did she convey for those ideas from thought to reality?
I think she was very good at words. I think she was, that's why I pointed out how her architect's watercolor drawing looks like the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice. I think she was very good at describing what she wanted. She knew what she wanted, and she was good at painting that picture with words. That's why I like that passage that she wrote about Cairo, and I like to contrast it with her husband's sort of did this, you know, because I think that was where she really excelled, was being able to communicate her vision. And you're right, she certainly had one. So no, I don't know of herself taking up much of a paintbrush herself, but she communicated with words.
Yeah, very well. So we have some questions. Could you tell me about her connection with Dodge McKnight, please?
The McKnight room is a room that she named in her museum about that, in honor of the artist or the collection of works that she had. But I personally couldn't comment on any, I just don't know any more about their connection other than knowing that she appreciated and admired the work. And one of those three rooms on the first floor, the smaller, more intimate sized rooms, is the McKnight room.
Great, thank you. Did she have an affiliation with Rogue Island in Maine?
I don't know. As far as vacationing and that type of thing, I don't know. I think generally her time away before her husband's death was spent in Europe and Asia. Actually, they went around the world. And following her husband's death, really her social activities almost, seemed to coalesce around her friends at Eastern Point in Dabbsville. But I don't know everything about her. I should say right here, and I'm not sure, I don't have my list of references and things in front of me that I passed on, but do, for heaven's sakes, look at the GardnerMuseum.org, the website for the museum, as well as their Instagram account, which is just Gardner Museum, are both splendid resources. The Instagram account will post something new every now and then, every few days really, and then a deeper story, a deeper dive. Somebody's doing research into something and it's a topic that they think everyone might find interesting. So if those aren't on the list, please go searching around the internet for Gardner Museum. And if we're waiting for, I just wanted to point this out as well, just because it's right here and accessible to us, the museum, that they're currently having an exhibit with Isabella's travel albums, and it's on view through the 21st, as you see. And I think that would be a splendid opportunity, really, to see what it was like for her to go those places all over the world.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible.
Sure.
Is her original home on Beacon Street a private home today?
I don't think it exists in that form at all any longer. I think it's been changed around, and I've stood there looking for 152 and have not seen it that way.
Thank you. Do you happen to know what the collection is valued at today?
Absolutely not. But we do know that when the robbery happened 33 years ago, last week, the value of the artwork stolen was 500 million. So there's no real way to put a dollar figure on it. I mean, if you've seen it, it's so chock-a-block full of things that no idea.
Many years ago, I saw in one of the vitrines, which was under a cloth, an item labeled as a lock of Keats' hair. Are you familiar with this item or the story behind it? Not that particular one, but yes, she has those vitrines. There are a lot of things. I don't know what that meant to her personally, or whether or not it was something that Jack, see, what we look at, what we tend to forget sometimes, I know I do, when I look at the current Gardner Museum, is that even though she was the only one alive at the building of this museum, much of the collection came while Jack was alive as well. So there may be things that were special to him, which I don't have the distinction for. So I'm not sure why she had a particular fondness for that, or whether it was her husband who did. I know that under some of those cloths, you find things like, pieces belonging to reportedly parts of Mary Queen of Scots clothing and things like this. So there were a lot of things that collected. Yep. Did she have documentation for an explanation of all the items and how or why they were grouped together?
Oh, absolutely not. It was her pleasure. Remember, that was her watchword, her motto. It's my pleasure. No. And so, there have been curators at the museum, people who worked as curators and in that position after her death. who make guesses and choices and who are familiar with the papers of hers that are available to read. But no, she's not spilling all the beans. Sometimes we just have to imagine what the connections might be.
There's a couple of questions in regards to her jewelry, and they wondered if it's displayed at the museum.
Not that I'm aware of those particular diamonds. No, I'm not. I haven't. I don't remember seeing jewelry displayed there other than maybe just a few small things inside some of the little cases, but nothing grand. Like I think I would have noticed those two diamonds.
Are her private rooms she used while at Fenway Court as she left them, or repurposed since her death?
Good question. I think at least in one case, I believe there was some immediate repurposing upon her death, in that they used some of them for conservation and care of the artworks. And so I think that space has changed. I have never seen a photograph of the fourth floor, and I've looked for one, but I haven't seen one published. But yeah, I believe that area has changed somewhat since her death.
Yeah. And someone asked, what was the justification for the addition to the museum? Hadn't she specified that there would be no changes? Sorry.
That's right. I know, you're talking about I have a picture of it. Hold on. Oh, we got to go through there we go. The 2012 edition by Renzo Piano. Yes, they made a choice to add to her museum, and I believe really did it as sympathetically as they could in terms of how to connect the two. If you've been, there's a little glass tunnel that connects, or glass walkway that does. They simply needed, in order, I'm just going to say it from a museum person's point of view, in order to remain a resource to the community, which is exactly what Isabella wanted her museum to be. And in order to remain viable and do education programs and to be pertinent in people's lives instead of just some fussy old dusty place, they had to have more space. They had to have changing exhibition space because of her rules about not changing things inside the palazzo. They needed, the kinds of things that modern museum goers want to have. We want a cafe, we want restrooms, and we want shops and education spaces and lecture halls and all. So, but really think of I know they tore down a greenhouse that was part of her construction, but I think that they did, I think what they gave in the end, what they built really outweighs any detriment to the property. I liked this. Renzo Piano, the architect, said he wanted his building, the one on the left there, to be like the respectful nephew to the great aunt. So I think that's sweet, and I think it's successful, but I think it had to be. It had to be in order for the museum to survive.
Thank you. And so there were some questions regarding her nephews, and so I'm gonna kind of put them all together. Did she maintain a relationship with her nephews, and were they involved in any aspect of the museum after her death?
Good question. All right, let me run it down for you. The eldest was Joseph, who was 14 when he was orphaned. He sadly died by suicide at the age of 25. The next youngest one was William Armory Gardner, who was 12. He really enjoyed and sort of learned from her a love of history and art, and particularly Greek art. So he studied and helped designate or create the School of Athens, art history programs in Athens. He was the founder of Groton School. He built a home that became Endicott College in Beverly, Mass. So he was, I don't know how involved he was perhaps with the museum going forward, but he certainly took over part of her interest and love for art and history. And the youngest one, Augustus, who was 10 when he was orphaned, was a military officer and then served as in the U.S. House of Representatives for Massachusetts and a Massachusetts state senator as well. So they had, two of the three had illustrious careers for years.
Someone made a comment about the Beacon Street house location became 1905 Governor Draper Mansion.
Yes, I knew it wasn't like it was in her day.
Someone had mentioned something about the fireplace and whether you knew if it was French, maybe?
Well, there are a lot. So rather than give us all whiplash, I won't zoom back through. She did collect things besides Italian. Don't get me wrong. There is actually one, maybe it's in the Gothic room, that is a French fireplace, I believe, that is has a coat of arms on it that's French. So when you go at it at the volume and the capacity that she had, and Jack while he was alive, they cast a very wide net for their collecting, and there are not very many pieces of modernism or that type of thing. She had some druthers, but they cast a very wide net, and it wasn't all Italian, but it was predominantly Italian for the big paintings. Of course, then there's the Vermeer, which is not, or the Rembrandt, which is not Italian at all, but were wonderful pieces to have in the collection.
Thank you. There's a question about whether she was religious, and if so, how deeply. I did notice there are quite a few pieces of artwork that were of religious in nature.
I think she was deeply religious, to answer your question. Absolutely, yes. She was raised Episcopalian. I believe she was. And I do think that was overlooked by many people. That's why I made the comment about Berenson, questioning why she would want that Christ on the cross small panel portrait painting, because maybe she didn't exhibit this. Maybe she didn't share it with a lot of people, but she certainly was. And was devoted to supporting charitable causes that were religious in nature. And as I said, she wanted a birthday, on her birthday, she wanted a service held at the chapel there. So she was deeply religious, a very devout woman.
The adjacent properties along the Longwood area, did she have ownership or connection with them? Or a relationship with the Jamaica Pond Parkway area? It seems visual right across the museum.
No, I don't know that she did. She just owned, she didn't own vast amounts of property. She just owned the property that the house museum was built on. If I read it correctly, the property that the addition in 2012 was built on was land that was not part of her original Fenway. So that's like right behind. I know that Smith College built up close next to her, which wasn't originally there when she bought her piece of land. So I think when she bought the land, of course, Jack had just died, she just bought enough to put her house museum on, and just admired the view from across the street. Yes, it was beautiful, and it still is beautiful to see that part of the area. But it's crowded now, and it wasn't back then.
Great. And I can't help but ask this question, since you have the slide in front of us, and this is the very last question. What is the significance of the hanging nasturtiums?
There you go. I honestly do not know if this was a tradition that she started or something that she just wanted to have, wished for it to happen, and it came into existence. But in April, and I think one can go on the website and call the museum and all, now this is pre-COVID, I'm just going to say, I haven't checked to see if it's happened since COVID, but they grow in their greenhouses offsite these magnificent trailing vines of nasturtium, and then in April, when they're ready, they put them on the balconies, as you see inside the museum, and let them spill down towards the courtyard. So how beautiful is that? Is if the thing couldn't get any prettier, they do that. So I will offer you that as a possibility. Maybe we have run into one another there next month looking at nasturtiums.
Wonderful. Well, that is all the time we have this evening. Mary, I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation on the
My
life
pleasure.
of
Thank
Isabella
you.
Stewart Gardner. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I will be sending a recap that has a link to the recording. There are some books in regards to Isabella Stewart Gardner's life. I will try to put some of those into the recap as well. And thank you again for joining us.
Oh,
Thank
yeah,
you, Mary.
thank you. Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good night, everybody.